She walked into that bar alone, and every biker in the room laughed. Then they saw the patch, and nobody made a sound. The Iron Wolves had been meeting at Rayburn's bar every Friday night for over 30 years. It was their place. Dark wood walls covered in old photographs, the smell of engine oil and beer permanently soaked into everything, a jukebox in the corner that only played classic rock. The kind of place that had its own gravity, its own rules, its own silence that meant something different than silence anywhere else. That particular Friday in October started like every other one. About 15 members had gathered around the long tables they always pushed together near the back wall. There were men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, broad shoulders, weathered faces, hands that had spent decades working on machines. They were loud the way people are loud when they feel completely at home. Laughing at old stories, arguing about nothing important, the way people do when they have known each other long enough that even disagreements feel comfortable. Nobody paid much attention when the door opened. She walked in just after 8 in the evening. She looked young, maybe 17 or 18, slim, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing a grey hoodie underneath a leather cut, a biker vest with patches on it. She walked straight, not hesitating, not looking around nervously the way most people her age would in a room like that. She went to the bar, sat down on a stool, and asked for a cola. The laughter started quietly at first. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The kind of laughter that happens when something seems out of place. A young girl, barely out of high school by the look of her, wearing a leather cut in a room full of men who had earned theirs over decades. Someone at the table said something low that the others chuckled at. Someone else said she must have found it at a costume shop. Another said maybe it was her father's Halloween jacket. The girl heard it. Anyone would have. But she did not turn around. She just sat at the bar, both hands around her glass, looking straight ahead at the bottles lined up on the shelf behind the counter. Rayburn himself, the owner, a wide man with a grey beard who had run the place since before most of his regulars had their first motorcycle, was wiping down the bar when she came in. He had not laughed. He had looked at her when she sat down, really looked, the way he looked at everyone who came through his door. And something in his expression had shifted, though he said nothing yet. One of the younger members of the Iron Wolves, a man named Kostya, got up to go to the bar for another round. He passed behind the girl and that was when he saw it. He stopped. On the back of her leather cut, in the center, was the Iron Wolves patch. The same eagle with spread wings, the same colors, the same font. But it was not a copy. It was not a print or a cheap imitation. It was the original design, hand-stitched, the kind of patch that had not been made that way since the early years of the club. And below the eagle, where member patches usually showed a road name or a rank, there was a single small rectangular patch that said 2 words. Founding member. And below that, a second patch. A name. Vera Molotova. Kostya stood very still for a moment. Then he turned back toward the table and said nothing, just looked at the oldest man in the room, a heavy-set man named Boris who had been with the Iron Wolves since the beginning, who had a long grey beard and hands like worn leather, and who had gone very quiet. Boris was already looking at the girl. He pushed back his chair slowly. The legs scraped against the wooden floor and the sound cut through all the other noise. People noticed. The laughter faded the way laughter does when the mood in a room changes without anyone quite knowing why. Boris walked to the bar, his boots heavy on the floor, and he stood beside the girl and looked at the jacket for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, quietly, "Is that Vera's cut?" The girl turned on her stool for the first time. She looked up at Boris with dark, steady eyes and said yes. She said her name was Natasha. She said Vera Molotova was her grandmother. She said her grandmother had passed away 3 weeks ago, and that before she died she had asked Natasha to bring the cut back to Rayburn's, to the Iron Wolves, because she said it belonged with the people who would understand what it meant. The bar was completely silent. Boris looked at Natasha for a long moment. His jaw tightened slightly. Then he pulled out the bar stool next to her and sat down heavily, like a man who needed a moment to carry something. He told her that Vera Molotova had been one of the 5 people who started the Iron Wolves in 1971. Not a supporter, not a girlfriend, not a figure in the background. A founder. She had helped write the original bylaws, had been present at the first meeting, had her name on the original paperwork. In the early years, before the club became what it was, Vera had ridden alongside the others, fixed engines when no one else could, talked them out of decisions that would have ended the club before it found its footing. She had left the riding life in her 30s when she had her daughter, but she had never been removed from the founding record. Her patch had never been given to anyone else because it could not be. It was hers. Most of the men in the room that night had joined in later years. They knew the name. They had seen it in the old photographs on the wall. But they had not connected it. Not in that moment when a young girl with a ponytail walked through the door in a jacket they assumed was borrowed or pretend. One by one, the men at the table stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. Slowly, the way people rise when they understand that something real is happening. Kostya came and stood nearby. Others followed. Someone turned the jukebox down without being asked. Boris looked at Natasha and asked what she remembered about her grandmother. Natasha thought for a moment. Then she said she remembered that her grandmother never asked for anyone's approval. That she walked into rooms and simply was who she was. That she used to say the loudest people in a room are usually the most uncertain, and the quietest ones have usually already decided. Boris was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, slowly, and said that sounded exactly right. Rayburn came around from behind the bar and poured 2 glasses without being asked. He set one in front of Boris and one in front of Natasha. He raised his own glass and said Vera's name simply, the way you say the name of someone who deserves to be said clearly. Everyone raised their glass. Natasha stayed for 2 hours. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, people listened back. She asked questions about the early years, about the rides and the decisions and the difficult seasons the club had weathered. The men answered with a kind of care they did not always use. Old stories came out that had not been told in years. Someone brought out a photograph from behind the bar, kept in a frame that had been there so long it had become invisible, the way things do when they are always present. In the photograph, taken outside this very building in 1971, stood 5 people in front of their motorcycles. Vera was the only woman. She was young, dark-haired, standing straight, looking directly at the camera with the same steady eyes her granddaughter had. Natasha held the photograph carefully with both hands and looked at it for a long time. When she finally stood to leave, Boris walked her to the door. He told her she was welcome at Rayburn's any Friday. Not as a guest. As someone who belonged there by something older and more solid than any of them. She thanked him. She put on the jacket, straightened at once, and walked out the same way she had walked in. Head up, back straight, without asking anything from the room. The door closed behind her. For a moment the bar was quiet in a different way than before. The kind of quiet that settles after something has shifted and everyone in the room knows it, but no one is quite ready to go back to ordinary noise yet. Then Boris sat back down, picked up his glass, and said that the lesson for the evening was simple. When someone walks through your door and you do not know their story, you do not know their story. And laughter is the cheapest thing in the world to give out and sometimes the most expensive thing to take back. Nobody argued with that. Some people carry their history quietly, on their backs, without announcing it. Some legacies do not arrive with noise or warning. They arrive in grey hoodies and old leather, through doors that the wrong people almost laugh shut, and they sit down at the bar and wait to be seen correctly. The patch was always real. The only question was whether the room was ready to read it.